the pressure gets too much on the Iranians, if there is too much economic pressure on the Iranians, too much military pressure on the Iranians, if they are watching as too much oil is getting out of the Strait of Hormuz under this U.S. scheme of boat-to-boat-to-boat transfers, then they may attack, and that will cause an escalation. So an interesting moment during the press conference earlier this week with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was asked, why just threaten to impose these sanctions on Iran and other countries that do business with Iran? Why are you not just imposing them? This economic D-Day that you're announcing, why don't you just implement it? Why wait? Why give this deadline? Why not just launch the D-Day against this existential threat that you think exists, Iran? Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent had an interesting answer. He said, I don't want to blow up the world economy. Interesting. Then you had this other comment from Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf on Twitter. Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf is a speaker of the Iranian parliament and the head of the negotiating team, or at least the former negotiating team that was trying to forge a deal with the United States to avoid a war and the crisis that we're now going through. And he said the U.S. is in no position to be throwing around its economic weight at this point. And I think that's all very interesting, especially given the recent action taken by Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent in trying to save the bond market, trying to prevent bond yields from going up. And what the Treasury Secretary essentially did is he used up new debt to try to buy up some old debt to prevent bond yields from going up. This is all kind of little complicated stuff, but it's like really the DNA of the U.S. economy and by extension, the world economy. What's happening is that the U.S. has like $40 trillion in debt, and there's so little confidence in the U.S. government right now. And there's all sorts of resentments that the U.S. government is building up. And there's also a lot of troubles taking place all over the world, which is causing some countries like Japan and maybe even China, other countries in Europe, to sell off their U.S. bonds, treasury bonds that they hold, which were, they thought, considered as good as cash. But because of the crisis caused by the U.S. attack on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you're having countries like Japan being forced into a position where they have to sell off some of these bonds, and that lowered demand for the bond raises the yield, raises the interest rate, raises U.S. borrowing costs, raises Americans' borrowing costs, raises expenses for everything, and it contributes to inflation and price inflation, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. And so the Treasury Secretary had to do this wild intervention where he basically used up new debt to buy up old debt. I mean, companies do this sometimes, but entire countries, and especially countries that are the linchpin of the global economy and countries that are $40 trillion in debt. They owe $40 trillion. That's what the U.S. is doing, and it's bleeding money. The U.S. is bleeding out. So in an effort to keep equities higher, keep people happy, the constituents of the Trump administration, the billionaires and the multimillionaires that are the backbone of the support of the Trump regime, keep them happy. It did this intervention. At what cost, we don't know. And for how long they can do this tap dance, no one really knows and no one really understands. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. In this edition of Badlands, a very modest edition, I have a couple of interviews, one with India's NewsX World and one with a new one. I think it's called Channel 1 Asia, some Pakistani channel, some outwardly looking Pakistani news channel that's in English. And they asked me about Iran and the crisis. I'll play those interviews later. The U.S. is trying to impose these sanctions on the Iranians and the Iranian trading partners. Scott Bessent basically has used words like asphyxiate, bleed out, choke out Iran and choke out its economy. And the Iranians seem rather sanguine about it. And that's in part because they're running the numbers. They're not idiots. They're looking at the U.S. oil reserves, which are at 40 days of oil reserves left. So despite all the lying and bullshit that the neocon shills in social media and in the newspapers seem to buy up, that the U.S. is getting all this oil out of the Strait of Hormuz, the strategic reserves are at an all-time low in the United States. As for other countries, I'm not sure about that, but obviously there's not enough oil getting out to get those reserves built up. U.S. reserves continue to go downward, continue to plummet. Meanwhile, you have the missile stockpiles. Missile stockpiles are at a low point, and the interceptor stockpiles are at a low point, so much so that they're hiring out like some sweatshop in the United Arab Emirates to use like laser printing and other tools to make interceptors in a desperate bid. And, the New York Times had a story about this, made it out to some like heroic adventures. Like, why would you need to contract this shit out to the United Arab Emirates? Why not just do it yourself? And the reason why is that they don't have the time to go through the procurement process, the putting it out for bids, the transparency. So they're just like funneling this business to some shady mafia run. I don't even know if you could call the United Arab Emirates a state at this point. It's basically a company town run on oil and petroleum and gas, money laundering and prostitution. Essentially, it's like a haven for escorts. And so this is where they're putting the production of these interceptors, and they show off about it like it's some big thing that they're doing, some war effort. But really, if you read through the lines, it's pathetic. And so they're running out of missiles, they're running out of munitions, they're running out of interceptors, and their oil reserves are way down. And the U.S. economy is in trouble. I mean, it really is in trouble, despite what the stock market is doing. And my part-time job is as a financial reporter. And so I get to look at all these announcements from companies and go through the earnings and so on. Earnings are pretty good, except when you account for inflation. And then they're just earnings are basically profits what companies make. If you run it through inflation, if you consider the inflation, if you consider price inflation, if you adjust for that, it's basically the flat. I mean, it looks good if you say, look at that, a 10% or 6% rise in profits year on year. But if you have inflation the way it is right now, it's not really that healthy for these companies. They're just kind of treading water at this point. The only deals that are being made are like AI deals and AI IPOs and AI mergers and acquisitions. Healthcare, lots of healthcare stuff happening, lots of consolidation in the healthcare industry, none of it really creating much in the way of jobs. And defense contractors, military stuff, much of it tied to Israeli defense tech, lots of money sloshing around in that sector. But as for food, retail, clothes, etc., not doing so well. Not doing so swimmingly. People don't have a lot of money to spend in the United States. The reality is not what you see in the stock market, which is basically just a lot of price inflation and a lot of speculation. And the seven darlings of Wall Street, these tech companies like NVIDIA and Tesla and a few others, Alphabet's Google and Meta, and all these tech companies are doing well with this bet on AI and data centers. And those are the deals that are taking place. Nothing in terms of decent sectors, manufacturing, that would create jobs for Americans or anyone else for that matter. And so the U.S. is in a slow crisis, as both Scott Bessent and Mohammed Bakr Ghalibaf seem to acknowledge in their comments about these sanctions. And this is why the U.S. is somewhat hesitant to impose these so-called D-Day sanctions on Iran right away, why there are more threats and bluster, and why they don't just impose and put the pedal to the metal. There's also worries about China. China has already come out and said, remember I said, I was wrong. I said, China's not going to say much about this. China came out and said, we're not going to abide by these sanctions. And they repeated language they've used in the past. They said, we don't believe in kinds of unilateral sanctions. Any sanctions, if you want sanctions, you go to the UN Security Council and get a resolution. We won't abide by this. We will protect China's interests and China's sovereignty. And so they recycle this old language, but they're saying we're not going to abide by these sanctions. And you know what? The U.S. didn't really impose sanctions on critical or crucial or even significant Chinese institutions or organizations. The sanctions were mostly on other countries and just individual companies and organizations. There was really nothing new to the sanctions, at least not yet. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for really going after China, especially with Xi coming next month to the United States to hammer out some kind of modus vivendi with the United States in terms of trade and economy and the world financial situation. And so there's no appetite to create this crisis at this point, at least not before November 3rd. That is the date of the midterm elections that the Republicans seem to be on course to losing. What you have is the reality emerging. You have this orgasm of rhetoric from Scott Bessent and the FDD crowd, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, all these neocon shills out on Twitter praising Donald Trump and, glazing him for these sanctions. And they having this kind of party. And then the bill comes due and they're looking at the bill and they're like, whoa. I imagine Donald Trump and Scott Bessent sitting at a table with like Mark Dubowitz and whoever else from like the neocon world. I don't know, Mark Levin and all these other neocon shills. Lindsey Graham's gone, bless his soul. They're sitting around the bill and they order all this food up and they order like champagne and another bottle of Cristal, Monsieur, and they bring all this food and they eat it all up. And at the end, Donald Trump is looking at the bill. And he looks around at the table and he's like, okay, so we're going to each pay our own way on this. And like Mark Dubowitz and Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro are like, wait, well, what are you talking about? You invited us to this party. And like, Donald Trump's like, no, this is way too much. I'm not going to pay this bill. We're going to have to share this bill. So now you have the bill due and the sobering reality that rhetoric aside, all sorts of propaganda aside, communications exercise aside, it's going to be really expensive and really risky and potentially catastrophic for the global economy, for the U.S. to move forward on this, especially at a time when every other country in the world is looking at the U.S. Look at the whole situation with Canada. They had like a deal ready to go. And then at the last second, apparently, and Donald Trump denies that this is how it went down. But like the last second, they put all these new impositions on Canada. Like we don't want to label stuff in French anymore. Essentially messing with the DNA of Canada, saying that we don't want to have to put our streaming services in French and we don't want to cater to like your native languages and all this stuff. And we want to basically just do whatever we want and added all these conditions. And the Canadians were like, no, F you, no deal with if this is what you want. This is insulting and this is bullying and we're not going to betray the 1/5 or so, I think, of Canadians that are francophonic. We're not going to betray them for the sake of some trade deal. Now, Donald Trump denies that this is what happened, but his words were very careful. He was basically saying, we didn't put anything in there about Canadians being able to speak French. Well, no one said that the Americans are trying to prevent the Canadians from speaking French. They don't care. What they were trying to say is that American businesses don't have to label their stuff in French when they sell it in Canada. And American streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime don't have to have like the equivalent of French language content and respect for French language in their content and their streaming services. That's what they're saying. They didn't say anything about speaking. The Canadians didn't say anything about the U.S. attempting to prevent them from speaking in French. It was about whether the Americans would have to do business in French when they're operating in Canada. In any case, I spoke a little bit about the situation with Iran and the potential impact of the sanctions with Ruby Barlow of India's NewsX World. That's coming up right now. Before I get to that, just a brief message. Hi, I'm Borzu Deragahi, host of the Badlands podcast and writer of the Badlands newsletter. You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Apple Podcasts. You can also find me on Substack. That's where I'm usually at Borzou, borzou.substack.com. Now, I'm trying to get people to upgrade their subscriptions and get paid subscriptions. I have enough ethics that I wouldn't put my lovely teenage daughter in this video in a bid to encourage people to upgrade, to show what a nice person I am and how I'm deserving and I need a little bit of extra cash to help take care of my life and keep doing this work. But I am shameless enough to show you my daughter's cute puppy, lovely puppy, Bella. Hey, Bella, good doggy. She's such a good dog, such an amazing puppy. She's super, super sweet, super nice. I don't know what this has to do with geopolitics, but I know that she's a super lovely puppy. And if I could get a little bit of cash to help pay for her treats and her training. Hey, puppy. Good puppy. I love puppies. And if you love puppies too, maybe you should subscribe to Badlands. Get a paid subscription as a gift for anyone in your life who might be interested. Thank you so much.
There's been some comments come out from Kali Barf, who has said that the US is not in a position to restrict relationships with Iran, some of those trading relationships that Iran has with other countries. There has been this new set of sanctions announced by the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and it looks like there may be potential secondary sanctions as well. What do you make of those comments coming from Mohammed Bakr Kalibaf? Do you think he's correct in his assessment saying that Washington is not in an economic position to restrict Iran's relations with other countries?
Well, I think that the United States could very well try to restrict relations with other countries, but I think that a lot of countries right now are very resentful of the United States. And so whether or not the U.S. has the economic wherewithal to do what it wants to do, I think diplomatically it's in a bit of a bind. It's having a big fight with Canada. There's tensions with Europe. There's tensions with South Korea. But the key is China. Will China cut off Iran? Will China's teapot refineries and secondary and tertiary banks stop doing business with Iran? And all indications are that no, they won't stop doing business with Iran at all, just as a matter of sovereignty as well as principle and economic interest. So I think that Ghalibaf has a point in saying that the U.S. is not in a position to force countries at this point to do what it wants. On the other hand, the United States could do damage by putting pressure on those countries. It'll increase the premium that they will demand, the discount that they will demand for Iranian oil. It will increase prices. So it will definitely mean more hardship for Iran and Iranian people.
Exactly, Bozi. I wanted to ask you on that note, what type of impact we could be seeing on the Iranian economy. Of course, those protests that we did see back in January were related to the inflation in the Iranian economy. And of course, the war has made a massive impact for those everyday Iranians as well. How do you think that these new sanctions, the primary sanctions, the secondary sanctions, may affect the Iranian economy and also the everyday Iranian consumer?
Well, already since this latest phase of the conflict, the Iranian currency, the rial, has further depreciated, and the Iranian equity markets, such as they are, have taken a big hit. So I think that it will definitely hurt people. But in January, when you spoke of those protests over economic frustration, the energy was directed against the regime and the regime's decisions and its actions and mismanagement. Right now, you're in a situation where Iran is under attack, and it's under very explicit attack. Scott Bessent said in a recent comment that he wants regime collapse for Iran, not even regime change, but regime collapse. And that's scary to a lot of people. So even if there is economic hardship, I think that given the context, the Iranian people will band together in support of the current status quo and in support of law and order instead of protesting because there is this dire existential threat.
Well, see, there's also these sanctions, when we look at this package that's been announced from Scott Bessent, it's targeting almost 60 individuals, entities, vessels as well, targeting a wide range of different industries, nuclear, missile, cyber, oil networks as well. And of course, there are those secondary sanctions that they're thinking of exploring as well. How do you think that this will, the application of these sanctions will affect the American relation with some of those countries and some of those industries as well?
Well, we've seen this before, and the Americans have tried this kind of sanctions, these targeted sanctions where they name an individual or a company or a ship, and it hasn't had that much of an effect. The Iranians, as well as the Russians and the Chinese and the Emiratis and all these other countries have gotten used to these U.S. sanctions by now, and they have their various workarounds. So I think that those aren't going to have so much of a huge effect. Look, I think that there is an element of theater here, with Scott Bessent going in front of the cameras and press conference announcing these D-Day sanctions, making these dire warnings and threats. The main point that's being hidden in this is that the U.S. is extricating itself from the conflict militarily. They're not talking about military options anymore, and they're trying to basically look tough as they're doing this. This is as much a communications strategy as a diplomatic or geopolitical strategy. So I think that is something to look at. You've had different phases of the war. You had J.D. Vance being out front. You had Pete Hegseth being out front. Now you have Scott Bessent being out front. We've yet to see Marco Rubio out front on the Iran issue. It just looks like they're cycling through various options. They got themselves into this mess. They're trying to figure out a way out that's politically palatable.
Of course, there is some sort of agreement that's being trying to be negotiated between Iran and Oman regarding traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. But if it is successfully implemented, are we ever going to see traffic in the Strait return to as it was before this war began? Not only do we have these new potential security arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz, but we also have the potential risk assessment of these shipping companies as they look at the last 6 months of conflict in this narrow channel. How do you assess the future shipping, what it might look like, the outlook for the Strait of Hormuz?
I don't think it'll ever really get back to normal, not under this situation right now. I think that Iranians, they took control of the Strait of Hormuz, and they're never going to give up on it completely. They might allow for the normal flow of traffic, but there's never going to be a situation where they can basically permit traffic to go back and forth as it was before without any kind of Iranian control. Once they took that as the spoils of war, they're not going to give it back. There might be some kind of financial imposition. There might not be. Right now, we're in a situation where the United States, working with its Gulf partners, is moving the oil from private ships into government ships and then crossing the Strait of Hormuz in these very dangerous operations with military escorts and helicopters overhead. And this is very expensive. And then moving it onto the other side of the Strait of Hormuz and then moving it back into commercial ships. This is a way to avoid the private ships' inability to cross the Strait of Hormuz because of their insurance premiums. And this is extremely expensive and this is extremely unsustainable. So eventually they're going to have to come up with some kind of mechanism whereby the Iranians are happy, the Omanis are happy, and the oil is flowing through. That arrangement probably will not make the Trump administration happy. I also spoke for the first time, actually, with a channel called Asia One News out of Pakistan. It's apparently their outward-looking station. And I spoke a little bit also about the situation with Iran and the latest efforts by Pakistan to negotiate and mediate between the U.S. and Iran.
Well, Field Marshal Asim Munir just made his third Tehran trip this year, meeting Iran's top military brass directly. How significant is this visit in the broader mediation effort?
Well, I think it's important. I think it's an effort on the part of the U.S. to make a last-ditch effort to get the kind of deal that they want. More likely than not, the Pakistanis are acting as intermediaries between the Americans and the Iranians. More likely than not, there was some kind of message passed on to Iran. Look, let's make a deal. Here are the terms that we want. But Iran is not going to give the U.S. the kind of deal that the U.S. wants. Because what Trump wants more than anything is to look good and be able to claim to his supporters that he won the war. And Iran is just not going to give him that because they have their own domestic challenges, but also because it's just not reality. The reality is that the U.S. gave it its best shot and they kind of lost. They kind of lost the war and they're forced to make concessions in a way to Iran. And they don't want to make those concessions in order to get back to the status quo ante. And in addition, there might never be a return to the status quo ante. The Strait of Hormuz might never again be reopened and the U.S. may never be able to get back to those bases. This is just something that the U.S. can't face and it can't actually embrace at all.
And look, Pakistan has positioned itself as a military channel into Iran's security establishment. How effective, in your opinion, has that mediation actually been so far?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how effective it's been. I'll let other people judge that because right now we still have this situation of no war, no peace. I think one criticism of the Pakistanis has been that they've been too eager to tell each side what they want to hear in an effort to get a deal done. And the motives for the Pakistanis are pretty noble, I guess. They want peace in the region, but they also want to bolster their own international legitimacy. So they've had this incentive to say very positive things about their meetings with the Iranians to the Americans and very positive things to the Americans about their meetings with the Iranians. And that might have been a little bit of a disservice in the interest of coming up with the greater good.
Look, Iran is threatening closure while still letting tankers through and talking to Oman on shipping arrangements. Is the real closure likely, or is this posturing?
Well, posturing. I think that there is a chance that Iran could further escalate and further tighten its control over the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a bluff. They have to balance, though, because on the one hand, they want to put pressure on the U.S., they want to put some pressure on the global economy, but they don't want to tank the global economy, and they don't want to alienate countries like Pakistan, India, and China, as well as Indonesia and other countries that are dependent on the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf itself for their energy supplies. So they have to balance their interests with that of the others. And in a way, they have to balance their own diplomatic portfolio with that of other countries.
Mr. Drogai, with sanctions escalating, diplomacy stalled. Where is this Iran-US standoff heading in the coming weeks? What would you predict?
I think that we're going to have probably a return to some kind of fighting or action. Maybe that'll be sparked this time by the Iranians. If the pressure gets too much on the Iranians, if there is too much economic pressure on the Iranians, too much military pressure on the Iranians, if they are watching as too much oil is getting out of the Strait of Hormuz under this U.S. scheme of boat-to-boat-to-boat transfers, then they may attack, and that will cause an escalation, and that will force the U.S. to respond in kind. And that could be very dangerous at this point. We also have two key elections coming up, elections in Israel, where Netanyahu is fighting for his political life, and midterm elections in the U.S. that could see a change in the balance of power in Washington and create more troubles for Donald Trump. On the other hand, the elections coming up and being over could also free Donald Trump's hands. The elections will sort itself out. Politics in Washington will sort itself out. But Donald Trump will be able to do whatever he wants without having to worry about what his Republican allies say and what their interests are. Hey, thank you so much for listening or watching. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. If you subscribe, even as an unpaid subscriber, you'll get the content as soon as it comes out. And also, I'm available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.